Just a tiny note about the format. I'm going to talk about this work for a little bit, and then say 30, 35 minutes we're going to draw. So just a heads up. I hope you're ready for that. So yeah, I did a dissertation in comics form, and apparently that's unusual. There aren't a lot of them as far as we know. But I'll say I approached it as why not? Why not do it in comics form? Why not doing it in, how do we think? What does thinking look like? So I approached it why not, but of course universities tend to be move a little slower and a little more narrow than we might want them to be. So part of my dissertation became arguing for itself. So my plan right now is to take you through a little bit of the general argument about the dissertation, which is going to dovetail into a more specific thing about some visual thinking and how comics work. And that'll set up the exercise that we'll do together. Okay. So, unflattening. Unflattening. It's kind of exciting. Unflattening. By unflattening, I need to tell you what I mean by flatness. And by flatness, I don't mean something literal, but I mean a narrowness of our sight, a contraction of possibilities. It's where we conform to patterns of one-dimensional thought and behavior, as Herbert Marcuse said. And I think the best analogy for this is to look at Edwin Abbott's 1880s book, Flatland, which I would guess a few of you are familiar with. And in Flatland, the geometric inhabitants of the two-dimensional world, they can understand how to move east and west and south and northwards, but they have no concept of upwards. They can't conceive of anything off that plane. And we can look at that and say, well, that's kind of silly, because it's easy to us being way up here. But what is upwards for you and I? What are the planes that we can't step into? So that's sort of the question I'm asking. And I think, unfortunately, and I think Phil spoke to this very well, unfortunately, I think education tends to foster the kind of flatness that I think we need to counteract, and I think this kind of group is here to do. I think we do it by we put our learning in boxes, and we put it in boxes of time and subject, and we put it in these small boxes. And so so that if you study mathematics, say, and you also happen to make art, that's a strange thing. So the boxes that our learning is subjected to tend to be boxes that we put ourselves into. And I think that harms us. And I think it's starting to happen earlier and earlier. I was very moved by a story in the New York Times about 3 or 4 years ago that talked about the decline in the sale of picture books. And the reason stated in the article was that the parents needed to get their 5-year-olds ready for tests, so they needed to read chapter books at earlier ages. And so, what are we doing? What take the complexity of a human that operates in a visual way and operates in all these complex ways? I think we're effectively funneling them into something that makes us a lot less interesting. It lines up our thought in a single dimension. And I think, it can put this in row upon row. And the particular rows that I was wrestling with. Dissertations are supposed to look sort of like this, 12-point type, double-spaced, 1.5 by 1 by 1 by 1 margins. But why? Why is serious thinking supposed to look like that? I think the answers go way back. I like to, if you think about, we can go as far back as Plato, who saw things like a reed that appeared to be bent by water and said, well, you can't really trust your senses because it's not really bent. And he went farther and said that images are shadows of shadows, so we dismiss them altogether. Descartes comes along and has similar distrust of the senses and says, the human is really just a thinking machine. Dissects the mind from body and says, so strings of words work really well for thinking machines, but it left the body and the eyes out of it. And so if we think about sort of the languages we speak in, sort of the stuff we breathe in and the stuff we swim in the ways that they can define what we're able to know, I think they confine what we can know at all. They're very powerful, but they can be confining because we can't see upwards that are outside of them. And if you think about it in this way, look at that. If you think about it, you take the complexity of the world and you try to, the complexity of our experience, and I want to pass it to you, I have to, in some way, I have to flatten it out. So you can think about it in terms of a map. I take the globe and I flatten it, and I think you all know, you know things like Greenland isn't really that big. You know that. You know there's distortions, because they have to happen. And you can take the second map that I put here, Buckminster Fuller's Dymaxion map, which is a different way to, he breaks it into an icosahedron first, and then, Brake flattens it out. And in his way, it shows connections rather than divisions, which is interesting. But it, too, is a different kind of flattening. So they're both leaving information out and distorting things. So it's a little bit like taking, figuring out what the weather is by using a thermometer. It tells you something, but every sort of mode we look through leaves out what it doesn't look at. And so that's the big question for me. It's like, what are we missing? When we're privileging one way of looking versus the others, what are the things that we aren't seeing? And then what can we start to see when we bring those other things in? And I think, if you're going to do a dissertation, you have a chance to put your dog in it, you really should. No, I'm serious. But if you think about a dog, you know that a dog's sense of smell is stronger than yours or mine. But a dog's sense of smell is not only stronger, it's more nuanced, which means a dog might experience this podium and know that Philip spoke here before, and know that the doctor spoke here this morning about facial reconstruction, and will know who was here the last week. We'll know all the things. It has a sense of time that you don't have access to. It has dimensions of experience. It has upwards that we can't get to. So, I think that's when we start to say, what if we bring those things in? We're not, maybe sense of smell isn't the thing we can bring in entirely, but that as a metaphor for the things we're leaving out. And so for me, comics were a way to be amphibious. I can breathe in multiple worlds at once. I can work in image and in text. And we think about working in two things. We think about our eyes. You think about your whole life, we navigate the world with two eyes that are giving you two different views the entire time. And those two views have to work together. If they don't work together, you bump into things, you can't catch, you can't navigate the world very well. But those views together bring you depth, they bring you perspective. They change how you experience the world. And instead, when you move from the cycloptic to seeing from two eyes or more, you can look at things not just head-on, but you can realize that they have sides, realize that you can turn them over, that you can walk around them. And then maybe you can introduce many, many sorts of eyes, many sorts of ways of seeing. And I think that gives us the ability to sort of step out of the flatness that we create for ourselves, that's created by the institutions we come from, and get a sense of perspective, get a sense of what those boundaries look like, and maybe find some upwards. Maybe find upwards that we didn't know were possible because now we're working in different modes. We're bringing in other ways of seeing. And so drawing for me, I think our typical image of thinking is, we all know this image, it's in this museum. Our typical image of thinking is sitting still and by yourself. But for me, when I draw, I make a mark. When any of us draw, we make a mark, and our visual system has a chance to interpret that mark. So all of a sudden, this visual system, which is doing all these amazing things every second, it's doing, the kinds of calculations that are going on that we can't be aware of. Your visual system is always doing. So now, when I'm drawing, it's not just me in my head. It's my eyes and the things I'm making on paper. And so we're a partner. We're a collaboration. And to me, I say that my comics are smarter than I am, but that's not like a sort of funny statement. I think my comics are smarter than I am because I have a good partner. And it takes me places I wouldn't expect. And so people say, what do you start with, words or pictures? And I say, yes. And again, that's not a joke. It is, the comic emerges out of me playing with words and playing with pictures in space. And so I want to give you one quick example from the dissertation itself of that process. So in the chapter on imagination, I wanted to do a sequence about stories. And talk about the transformative power of stories. And I had the idea to work with Scheherazade from the Arabian Nights, and so I had some initial ideas for it. And I had started it, And I thought because her stories are all stories within stories, that I would do this sort of visual stories within stories. It would zoom, each image would sort of link to the one before, either with a zoom or some sort of metaphorical link. But in the midst of it, I also wanted to talk about science. And I wanted to say that by stories, I don't just mean the fanciful, but I mean things like science, because science is a kind of story of how we make sense of the world. And so if I was writing, I would have said, and by stories, I mean things like science as well, and put my period and moved on. But here, I had set up this visual scheme, and I'm not sure that I was actually this far along when I had to deal with this, but I'd set up this visual scheme, and I had to figure out what went there. How does it work? How do I not just cheat with words, but make the pictures do the work? How do I have the images embody the idea rather than talk about it? So I started searching thematically, I was searching for the time that the nights were written for some sort of scientific discoveries, and I stumbled on the work of, this is called the L2C, the 2C couple, which doesn't really matter, but it's work that helped Copernicus do his groundbreaking thing, uncredited work, by the way. And I was all excited because I had Copernicus in an earlier page, and basically this says, even though nothing changed except perspective, that changed everything. So I was like, oh, now I have this tie back to it, and it's a circular image, and I have these circles and I have eyes, and so now the images are telling me what to do in the research, and the research is telling me what to do with the science, and I'm going back with the drawing, and I'm going back and forth between it, and I'm making sketches, and I'm studying this science. I spent about 3 weeks for what ended up to be, I think, these 4 panels. If you have deadlines, I don't recommend this sort of method. But the flip side is I think this is what learning is. Learning is you have these partners and you discover things and you get pushed on a journey. So this is the very first sort of notes that I made for what the dissertation would be, and I just sort of dug this up as I get the book ready. It's sort of exciting to see what was there in the beginning, how it grew, how it evolved. And I think in working this way with this visual as a partner, it's really opened spaces for me, and it's made learning a journey. And I think when we think as educators, that's what we want it to be. That's what we want students to, we want them to find the ways to go. We want them to have the tools to go. But in opening and encouraging multiple modes, and encouraging the ways, in the way that the dog sees upwards, when we bring those things in, we really find out where we can go, rather than finding out where we're supposed to go by somebody else. And so, with that said, I'm going to teach you a little bit about comic books, specifically, how I organize all this stuff so that you're ready to make your own, or at least ready to make the exercise. Comics are a terribly named medium. I know when I say I did a dissertation in comic books, I usually get the thing where people say, oh, you mean graphic novel. And that somehow seems a little bit more mature. I'm not sure why. But I don't care. I'm going to embrace this word. So comics, the best, if you're interested in this, the teacher's here for sure. Scott McCloud, whose little panel is right there, wrote a book in 1993 called Understanding Comics, which is just a wonderful starting point to think about comics, and a wonderful starting point to think about visual thinking. His definition of comics was juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. Basically, my fist here, draw a box around it, draw another box around that one, you guys stitch the things together and you make meaning. It's a sort of linear sense of time. This image next to this image, reader does the work to put it together. And so, in that way, comics do read a lot like text, left to right, top to bottom, but they're visual, which means you can't help but see the whole all at once, which means you're making connections top to bottom, left to right, and the whole is part of what you're making meaning of, which is where I think comics start to get really exciting. So this is an example from Watchmen, a well-known comic. In that middle panel, I think the character is making a meta-commentary on how this works. There is no future, there is no past, you see. And so I think what that means is that, yeah, this panel came first, and this panel came last, but they're all still there. You can't help, because it's visual, you can't help but see it all at once. So it means that we're sure able to read linearly, sequentially, but we're also reading simultaneously, because we're viewing it simultaneously. It's become a piece of art. And I think that's really neat. If we think cognitively, I think the left-right brain thing is getting dismissed a lot. But I think one aspect that is staying is that they are two different kinds of awareness. One is very focused on linear, sequential, focused stuff, and one has a more zeitgeist, a different word, a more all-over sense. And if you think about that in your life, it's important to be able to focus on things and do a task, but also to have enough awareness around you so you don't get eaten by something. So I think comics let you do both of these modes. They let you be tightly focused and also all over aware at once. So I'll give you just a couple examples. This is a French cartoonist, and you can see there's a linear story, but I assume you'll see the thing that occurs when you see the whole at once. If you do sort of, I don't know, laugh or nod, you could all nod. You know, the pyramid is part of the story, and this is about the Louvre, which also has a pyramid, is significant to it. Here's a comic, this is Gasoline Alley from probably the 40s or 30s. You know, this character is moving sequentially across the scenes, but across a simultaneous scene that's all happening at once. So both modes are happening. And another one from Gasoline Alley, we're not moving through it, but the whole scene is at once, but we're having separate moments within it. And one more, this is a sort of a joke, so I will wait till you laugh about it. So it's something that really can only happen in the way that comics mash up time and space. You know, film works frame by frame by frame. Comics put the frames in one space, so it's a very different thing. And this is back to my dissertation, this allows you to do some pretty neat things. This is a page about talking about my wife's commute, which was very varied, and the typical commute, which tends to be the same every day. And so hers is in the foreground, the other one is in the background. So not only do I get to draw the different commutes, but also the space itself is representing that pattern in the background of this boom, boom, boom. It's the same rhythm versus this sort of drift that comes across the front. So it's letting me do two kinds of thinking in one space, which is really sophisticated. I mean, I think people talk about comics as being sort of simplified. I tend to think you can make things harder, but also still accessible. So let's talk about a couple other aspects of comics before we start drawing. So I'm saying that they can use sequential and simultaneous thinking at once, but they also very obviously let you do visual and verbal things at once. So text becomes part of the image. Text gets to speak to the image. It gets to resonate with it. And it can do it, it can be ironic in how they speak to each other. It can be a lot of ways. And it can be, if you see this sort of zigzag, the text helps you know how to read it. So just right there, just having the text move changes how you experience things. And here the text becomes a very visual element. This is the sort of onomatopoeias, the splash. And this is a favorite one. Yeah, you saw it. The smash. I mean, just sort of the ways that words become visualized. And I think, I don't know, is there a visual facilitator at this conference working on that? I'm sure you've seen them, people who take notes that are visual and verbal all at the same. If you haven't, there's a guy, Mike Brody, who does sketch notes. There's a number of that kind of thing. I think comics are quite different in how they order things, but the visual verbal part is quite similar. And the other aspect is the multimodal, which educators would be familiar with, the idea that image, action, gesture, all those things are part of communication. I'm talking to you, I'm looking at you guys, you're nodding, you're smiling. Those things are all part of the transmission of communication. And comics do this very well, and I'll just look at the top. Just look at the top panel. So there's two actors doing their actions. There's dialogue, which is saying stuff, but then the way that the characters are colored, different ways that the characters are colored, the different ways that they are rendered, the ways their word balloons are different, and the ways their font of the word balloons themselves. There's all these sort of very simplified but deep layers going on that you take in all at once. In the same way in a conversation, you take in how somebody looks at you or looks away from you while they're talking. So it's all right there. So this sort of brings me to what do our thoughts look like? Does anybody out there think in straight lines? Rows of straight lines? Does anybody think only in words? Well, there's always one person. All right. So I think comics let us get at, I've been better at doing this in public. I tend to speak in parentheses a lot. But I think that's how they work. We have tangles. We think sideways at the same time we're thinking straight ahead. This is Chris Ware, sorry it's unlabeled. He's a contemporary cartoonist, very famous. And he talks about comics as getting memory. And so he has tangents, and he has linear, non-linear moments, and he has sideways moments. And it's all about capturing memory, and in a way that memory is not a very straight line. And so, you know, comics often get compared to storyboards. I'm sure you've, and maybe if you've done anything with comics in classrooms, you've thought about it in that way. And there's some similarity in that comics, you know, a storyboard, you pick what goes in the frame and what's in the next frame. But comics, you not, because of the spatial nature of it, you not only choose what goes in the frame, but you choose the shape of the frame, the size of the frame, where on the page the frame is, what the frame is next to, and what it's not next to. So all those kinds of choices start to that was more exciting than I thought I'd say. Yeah. All those sorts of choices make the medium really have a lot of content. So let me give you one example here. This is Little Nemo from like 1908. And if we whited out the pan, I mean, you can see here his bed grows and, you know, it grows and gets bigger and he goes across the city, and at the end he wakes up and everything shrunk back to normal. But if I whited out the boxes, I think you'd get a sense of that growth. You'd see that something small grew and then returned. And so you might, you know, we'll just look at a couple comics and how they sort of carve up space. You know, very different, there's this sort of rhythm of these little things, and this is a different grid. This is from this, whoa, that got moved. This is from the same comic, I don't know what happened there. Sort of rhythmic, there's like beats, and you can sort of feel the heartbeat on that left one. And the other one is much more fractured, though you can't see it. This is incredibly fractured. This is probably playing off of things like bullet time in the Matrix and video games, all these layers of experience on top of each other. And so I think in some sense comics are a little bit like architecture in that we design a space for you to move through. And we direct you, but you also, a little bit like in the museum with an audio guide, you know where the things are, but you can also see that there are things off to the side. So let me tell you, so we're going to draw now. I'm going to set this up. You guys are all ready. You're all very willing. So I want you to think about, and this room is an amazing room, but not good for me pointing out grids. It's a rare opportunity to be in a room that's not a big grid. Wonderful. But you think about how comics, all the stuff I've just been showing you, sort of carve up the shape of a page into different kinds of grids. And I got excited thinking about this and started looking at grids all over New York City, which is filled with them. And like, how does that, you know, how do they convey experience differently when I have a bunch of dots, when I have, you know, these triangles? Let's see what else. When we have brick patterns. Oops, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So what I want you to do, this is two sets of instructions. The first set is, take your sheet of paper, doesn't care what your sheet of paper looks like, and use the entire sheet to carve it up into some way that you feel represents the shape of your day. It can be today, it can be a fictional day, it can be a typical day, it can be, you know, your day. It's your day, I can't decide what day it is. Okay, so carve it up, and you have to use all of it. So if you leave part of it blank, that means something. So you're welcome to leave parts of it blank, but you gotta mean it. This is not like writing where I can write a couple paragraphs and I get to the middle of the page and I stop. So wait, I haven't finished the instructions. You guys are so eager, it's hard to stop. So the second part, that's how you start, and you can do the whole thing. You don't even need to do the second part, but I'll tell you about it. As I was thinking about this exercise, I was running along a boardwalk and I noticed paint that was spilled on the grid I was running on. And I thought about, my wife does abstract gestural painting and throws paint, and I thought how that captured her motion and emotion. So I want you to think about the shape of your day on a single sheet of paper, carve it up how you want, and then if you choose to, inhabit those boxes with a mark, a line, a gesture that represents either your motion or emotion in those moments that you broke up. You know, and I started seeing things like how the oil got dragged on the sidewalk. So I don't, you know, this is the view flying into Michigan. So however you choose to. And the second part, you can skip if you really need to skip it. Does that seem clear? Carve up your, all right, overly clear. Have at it. You've got 5 minutes. I don't really know how long we got. I'm going to come. do you think? Are we about a good place? Some of you? I mean, we could, sadly, my comics take longer than the 10 minutes I gave you, but you've probably made something fantastic. This is tricky, this is a phenomenal room, but it's enormous. So how about for 30 seconds, share with the person next to you that you know or don't know. And then I want 3 volunteers who are willing to tell us about their drawing. So, you get 30 seconds to share it, and then in 45 seconds, I need 3 volunteers. So if you think yours is awesome, which they are. I don't know if it's possible to get you back once, this might have been it. I don't want to stop your sharing, but I'm going to be mindful of trying to wrap things at some point here. So I need three, I'd love to come pick you out of the audience, but I'm causing enough trouble with the mic. So I need 3 volunteers. Sir. All right, he's going to, yeah, I think you can go to the mic, yeah.
Volunteers come to the mics.
Yes, even better idea. And unfortunately, I wish we had some camera we could get in on this. So, I can't see it, but I'll take your word for it.
All right, so my day's been pretty scattered since I woke up this morning, so you kind of can't see the panels, but it kind of starts off with a very large kind of like cup of coffee. So a little bit of kind of, I guess, relief, waking up, a little enjoyment. But then the next few panels are, you know, scattered light bulbs because of all the different ideas or things that I need to tackle today. And then there's the one that has the broken light bulb, which is kind of like my issue of having a broken dishwasher this morning and trying to figure out what to do with that. The next larger panel is kind of like the door opening up as I go outside, and then you kind of see me like cheering in terms of freedom. In terms of kind of being able to let go what was inside and going out and moving on. The next smaller panel is my burrito at Chipotle. My next 3 panels are kind of overlapping a little in terms of when I finally was able to sit down to do work. I had a couple options of what to choose from. So I kind of had option 1, option 2, and then kind of an arrow pointing in terms of where I was going next. My next panel was my trip here to the museum where I kind of got stuck in traffic. 475, but the panel it's kind of split in half because I decided to detour to Monroe Street to get here, and then the next panel, which is kind of a larger panel, which kind of was kind of adding to my excitement of being able to get here on time to make it to the session.
Cool. Just a quick, I gotta move, sorry. Quick question for you. Are you a drawer? Yeah? Yeah. We have a ringer. But the thing, go ahead.
Just quickly, if you're going to volunteer, then please go to the WGTE camera at the end of the session so we can get this and insert it.
And unfortunately, I can't see it well enough. But I mean, you made choices right away about fracturing the early space. I mean, so you're making all these decisions about, you know, that are you a comics maker?
I am.
All right, we'll talk later. But anyway, the point is, he's making, whether he is a drawer or not, he's starting to make all these kinds of choices about how to think about the shape of his day, which he happens to be a drawer, but I don't think those are things you had to know to do what you just did. And you did them very quickly. Anyway, we'll talk later. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm not a drawer or a comic book maker.
Yeah.
But, okay, so...
Starting now.
Mine is divided basically into three. I have a child with a sensory processing disorder, and so every day has to be the same. And so I have it separated into morning, afternoon, and evening with alarm clocks. But I am not a sensory person. I'm a little bit more frayed on the end, so the lines are a little blurred. And then there's a crack in the middle because every day you just don't know if something's going to happen, and that's that little rift where it makes it a little exciting. So that's,
Cool. Can you face it here just so that sounds fantastic? Yeah, I get it. Yeah, cool. Thank you. So again, I mean, you know, right there, her whole day, I mean, you could have written about your day in a diaristic sort of way, but it's in the patterns that she drew it. It's all right there. Can we get the last one, or you guys are shyer than... You don't have to. Okay, so I'm going to make, I'll let you off on this, but I'm going to come around and see all of them. I'll say two things before, I'm going to wrap up with a few notes about that. If you care to share them with me, you're welcome to email me, and also I'm giving away free comics excerpts from this, so if at the end you can come up and grab them, and it's got my contact, and I would love to see what you did, since it's a little too large for me to go around and see them all. But I did see what you were working on. And I think my clicker. It's upside down. So I thought about, when I was finishing the dissertation, the last few chapters, I thought about doing this myself, because I hadn't. I tried it with people, but I hadn't done it. And so I wanted to make a page, it's a little bit similar to the last speaker here, that was about sort of an automated routine day. And so I designed the page first, and I think you can kind of see in ways that you talked about the fractured spaces. It has sort of loose spaces, and it has this very regimented center. And so this ended up being the drawings, but I think the idea was pretty implicit in the design. And it kept going, and then it started to break apart, and then completely fell apart right here. So I just want to close by thinking a little bit about drawing. And coming back to our eyes, you know, our eyes are always comparing these two different views. Our eyes are always making relationships. And we do it even with, you know, even without two eyes. The fact that, you know, need a good surface here. None of you can see the top of this, can you? Maybe somebody up there. But you know there's a flat surface here. You know it because you know enough you've experienced the world enough. So, in some sense, I really like this. Perceptual experience is a way of encountering how things are by making contact with how they appear to be. So we're always having that relationship between what we know about a round plate and what we actually see. We only see that it's round when we're directly on top of it or directly below it. But we know it's round, and that's the way that people can trick you with optical illusions. Our eyes are making relationships. And I think drawing is exploiting the fact that you can't help but make relationships through your eyes all the time. And so it's taking something on paper, you know, I draw this random line, and you may already start to be reading things into it. And I think, you know, the origins of how we made intentional drawings come out of recognizing marks made by ourselves, made by animals, made by rocks rolling down hills. But we recognized things in those marks and said, oh, I see that. And I think this sense of relationships, unfortunately I didn't get to see enough of your drawings, but you know, how many people put a jagged line in their drawing? A lot of you. Okay, just one person shout out, what did your jagged line mean?
My commute.
Your commute. And what about your commute?
The one in the evening when the traffic is
Crazy. So the jagged line meant crazy.
Stress.
It meant stress. So we know, we know jagged lines mean something sharp, we know they mean something intense, like your heart's racing. And in comparison, who had a smooth, sort of a curve in theirs? Couple, can you tell me just what it meant?
Relaxation.
I heard relaxation, I didn't hear yours. It meant everything's connected, so it's harmonious in that way? We know these, whether you're drawers or not drawers, you know what sharp things are, you know what jagged things are, and you know what soft curves are. You know what a line rising up is because you know what it feels like to stand up against gravity, and you know what it feels like to fall. You know what it means to have things that are next to each other versus things that are far apart. So I think about, and I'm not going to go into it, but I think if we think of where our ideas come from, where our ability to make, meaningful, abstract thoughts, comes from this very basic sense that we live in the world, and we visually and bodily experience the world, and experience it in relationship. And I think we build up our concepts of more sophisticated concepts from those very simple, spiky and smooth and close to and far from. That is how we live. So I think I think that's it. As educators, as artists, as all the things that we are here, if we think about how important that thing that everybody comes into the world with. My 7-month-old daughter is figuring out all these relationships in our world. She doesn't know that much about the plate being round until she's turned it over 300 times. But she's learning all those things. If we embrace that complexity of who we are, I think that's what we're all here to do. That's what I've been hearing. And I'm really excited to see this continue to grow. So thank you for your time, and then we'll take a few questions. I think you have to go to the mics, or you can.
Can you hear me from back here?
I can hear you.
Okay. When I do my drawing,
Yeah.
I have 8 equal panels.
Uh-huh.
Similar to what you would find in commercial cartoons.
Yeah.
And the research that you did, do you find that the panels, are almost universal with cartoonists, the way that they draw? Because in each panel that you have, either the thought or the conversation that continues, and then the response in the next panel. Am I making this clear? So that it goes on, it continues on, and every cartoon that you see is almost identical with regard to space.
I'm going to say no. I think cartoons, like the examples I showed you very little where they were the same, right? I think in the case of, say, a newspaper cartoon, I think a newspaper cartoon, they tend to be, especially because of the limited size of the format, like the single strip. I think you're absolutely right. They tend, if not exactly the same size, they're pretty close. A Peanuts cartoon is, the same, like 3 setups, and then the joke is in the 4th panel. I tend to deal with things that take the whole space. And I think if you look at comics from the 30s and the late 30s into the 50s, they do tend to be much more, one drawing, one panel. I think the sort of explorations of space in the ways we talked about are a little bit newer phenomenon in comics. I don't know if I'm...
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to see your drawing.
Oh, okay.
You don't sound convinced. Another person?
Next, what do you work in the tablet when you do your drawing? What programs do you use?
Oh, sure. Just give it away. I do work digitally. I work on a tablet that I draw on here, and I look at a screen. I work on a Wacom tablet, and I draw in Photoshop. I did it because I have severe issues with making legible letters. So I could use a font. I don't know that I recommend it. It's actually not that good a tool. It's a very powerful tool, but it's harder than it needs to be, which is good for me because I don't like people to know that I draw digitally. So it makes it harder for me. It looks like I drew it on a piece of paper. Does that make sense? But I'd be happy to talk specifics about tools. I think working on paper like you guys did is the best way to start to think about space. And most of all the design work I do up until like I'm ready to commit to something is all on thousands of pieces of paper. Yeah. Hey.
With some of the examples you showed, you worked with obviously the grid shape like we talked about.
Yeah.
But then after that, you kind of broke away from that grid and kind of had, you still had the confinement of the panel itself.
Of the page, you mean?
The actual square in some of them. With,
okay.
With the caterpillar or the centipede on there, but you still had some of those squares.
Yeah.
My question was about just the gutter itself, or the space in between the panels. If you were to get away from even just the confinement of a square, triangle, circle, rectangle, whatever it is, would that then disorient the viewer enough to where it would just be almost too much, or would that kind of help with the proper content?
No, I understand your question. If he didn't, I think he's asking the difference between sort of a box of some sort with space between versus things next to each other with a more organic space in between. There's definitely cartoonists who work without boxes, I think it can be. I mean, I think it's counting on the reader a little bit more to understand that sort of flow, but hey, we saw the same character, obviously it's a separate moment. I think if you look back in history at things that aren't comics, but sometimes get called comics today, like the Bayeux Tapestry, some of you would be familiar with that. I mean, it's this long scene and there's lots of stories happening, and typically there's like a tree, they'll use a tree, and that tree is sort of the division between that panel and the next. I mean, it's very loose, but it's there. I mean, I think both can work. I think there's less examples of the sort of less boundaries. But they have great potential for different effects.
And I just had another question.
Yeah, please.
The opposite of that, taking away the grid and actually having a full, gasoline alley. If you were to take that whole scene and take away the actual grid itself and just have said character walking through an entire scene, how would that change from the grid? Since you don't have the space in between.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think it may stop being comics at some point. It may, I mean, it's pop, I don't know, that's maybe too strong a statement, but I could see it stopping being comics because I think one thing that comics helps you do is sort of direct your attention. Even though it lets you do all of it, it still helps you move through it. I think it's possible that could shatter your ability to know where to go. Sometimes you want that. I mean, I know in my own work, sometimes it's like, I want you to go here, and you're going to go, that Scheherazade thing. Even though it was complicated, you couldn't go the wrong direction. But sometimes I want you to go the wrong direction and find other connections, which is less common in sort of narrative comics. That's where I'm going to go with that answer. Just answer my own question, sorry.
All right,
Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more, or is that it?
We have time for one more, if there's one.
One burning question.
Man, well, not.
Oh.
There we go, my Sam, please.
You got a ringer in the audience. Thanks, my Sam. Two of them.
Well, no, and it may be completely irrelevant to
Ah.
what you do and what you're going to do next. But I'm just curious, maybe building off of the last question, what happens if this kind of structure that you produce is moved into, say, 3 dimensions?
Cool. Yeah, I've thought about that a little bit. I had in the class I taught at Parsons some architecture students, and I really tried to push them to play with making comics that merge the two things. I had one boy, one made a drawing that showed how it worked, but one made an actual, it was like a little architectural model, and it had drawings and writing on the surfaces and on the walls, and it was really interesting. I mean, I think I've thought about this question, like, what if I decided instead of a comic to make an art show that you walk through, and how, would you use windows in some places to see things that are behind, and would you use transparent? I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. I think comics kind of rely on the staticness of the page and the fact that you hold them in your hand and you read. I mean, I've been in art shows, and it's always a little weird because they're not meant to be on the wall. They're meant to be in your hand. So that you're shifting that dynamic. I think it's something we're going to see. I think we'll see some play of walkable comics. There haven't, to my knowledge, been very many that are beyond novelty. But it's definitely would be exciting to try that. So, thanks.
And of course, Nick is available, and certainly has made himself so by volunteering to see all of your drawings.
That's right. So, and you can all have a free excerpt of the book/dissertation if you come up and take one.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much, Nick. That was
Thank you.